Welcome back to our channel. Help us print our next issue by buying us a coffee. Thank you for supporting Archetype.
For the past 2 hours, I've been watching a Dennis Hopper documentary, trying to get up to speed with who Dennis Hopper is, not just from the essay that you wrote, which is fantastic, by the way, but I sort of wanted to understand what he actually is like when you see him in person, how he speaks. And I was trying to watch his movies. I was trying to find Easy Rider riders, but I could not find the movie for the life of me on any streaming platform.
Oh, that's a shame.
It was on Amazon Prime, but in the US, so I couldn't get it there.
Oh, I'm sure that there's somewhere to locate it. Yeah, however you can watch it, I recommend it. It's a good film.
Yeah, absolutely. But from the documentary that I did watch, which I found on YouTube, it really changed my perspective on Dennis Hopper as a person. I felt like he's such a creator. He's not just an artist. He has a vision that not a lot of people can say they have. So I really just wanted to dive into it and start talking about Dennis Hopper and get your perspective on sort of what drew you to him, what you find interesting about his work. So feel free to take it from there.
Yeah, so, well, it is quite interesting because, as a kid, I suppose I was kind of introduced to Dennis Hopper through mainstream cinema, something like, he appears as the antagonist in the film Speed with Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock. So that would have been a film that I would have probably been exposed to. And, obviously he's also the antagonist in Super Mario Brothers and things like that. So, yeah. It's a very odd situation. But then I guess as I got older, into my teenage years and into my early 20s, and I attended film school as well. I remember going out to Virgin Megastore. This was back in the UK as they were slowly selling off their VHS collection. And I brought Easy Rider and I brought Scorsese's Mean Streets and another film by a British filmmaker called, the film was called 24/7. Can't quite think of the director's name. Shane Meadows was the director. And I took it home on a Friday evening and I watched it on a Sunday morning with a bit of a hangover or something like that. And I was just kind of blown away by it. And I remember just putting it on again, really, really soon. To me, that film doesn't feel like a film. It feels like putting on a record or something like that. It's such a film that has obvious connections to music because of its soundtrack. And yeah, so that was kind of my introduction to him as a director. But he does also appear in that film. And then a few months later, I caught David Lynch's Blue Velvet, and Dennis Hopper appears in that as again, another antagonist. And that kind of performance really blew me away, and he's much more recognizable in that film as well. And so I kind of just went on this journey of just trying to just go over the filmography of his. At this point, this was early 2000s. So by this point, his career had the majority of it was already over, in some respects. I mean, he still made films in the last sort of 10 years of his life, but all of the films that you can kind of point to, they're all prior to, the year 2000, I suppose. So I just went on this big hunt of tracking down as many of these films, of his films as I could. And then realizing as well that he'd done more direction than just Easy Rider. He'd also directed a few other movies as well. And then, reading a few biographies of his about him, you kind of get this idea, it lingers in the background a little bit, but that he was also an artist and a photographer as well. And that kind of remained pretty much hidden, or as a sort of a footnote in his in his history until he actually dies, and in 2010. And then suddenly there's this kind of renewed interest in him as an artist, and all these kind of monographs started to be published. Eventually, I guess people who were looking after his estate after his death, we're just finding all these contact sheets and all this, photography work, and also his art collection as well. He was an artist, but he was also an art collector and curator, and so he had all this incredible artwork as well that, you know, was being put up for sale. I guess it was just this kind of hidden history, this hidden event within his life, kind of sort of rose to the surface because there was no more film work. You could kind of concentrate on what was happening with him as an artist. Dennis Hopper is pretty much connected very heavily with the 1960s, but also the kind of excesses of that era and the drug use, alcoholism that he kind of fell into for a number of decades.
What drew you to wanting to write the essay about him, Parallel Lines?
Well, back in 2016, I had a book published called Create or Die, which came out with Amsterdam University Press. I'd actually been working on the book for several years before it was published. But in that book, there is a chapter that does engage with the art and photography of Dennis Hopper. But one of the things that I always felt about it was that it's an academic book, and there's a lot of academic language, and it's an academic engagement with that work. And also as well with the book itself being published by an academic press, I was kind of always under the realization that, you know, if you were going to read this book, you would probably already know about him. What I wanted to do was rewrite that chapter as an essay that would be read by a more popular audience, you know, someone who was only passingly engaged with Dennis Hopper's work and would read it and be quite surprised that that this was something that was happening. So I kind of just started from scratch with it, basically, and just went over some of the research that I'd put into that book.
Yeah,
if that makes sense. Yeah,
absolutely, and it definitely comes through. I've known in the back of my head about Dennis Hopper, but I had never delved into any of his, you know, artistic endeavors that you write about in the piece. His photography is fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, it just it captures the 1960s, which was predominantly when he was working as a photographer. He's kind of been blacklisted from Hollywood, so his main sort of endeavor at that time was just taking photos. But it's kind of like street photography, some of it, but then, you know, he was also taking photos of all the people that he was hanging out with at that time. So people like the Rolling Stones, and all the sort of the LA folk artists and Andy Warhol and people like that, you know, just really capturing that decade in such vivid detail. Yeah, it just paints a really positive image of the 1960s, I think. But then also, you know, he did also engage with some political events as well, such as the march with Martin Luther King. And so he was there taking photos of that as well. So it's a real document of that as well, the civil rights movement. So, yeah.
One of my favorite parts of your essay is when you're describing the photograph he takes of Martin Luther King when he's giving his address, and he has all the mics in front of him. It was just such a fantastic way of describing the photo, and you sort of you sort of give it a perspective of what the image could be telling us when we're looking at it.
I mean, obviously that is just like I'm taking some artistic license with that. You know, it could have just been where Dennis Hopper was standing in the vast crowds of people that were hovering around Martin Luther King as he was making his like speech. But yeah, like the microphones are centered and he's pushed to the side of the frame. Yeah. And the sort of tangle of microphones that are in front of Martin Luther King is really the actual sort of focus of the image. And I guess when I saw it, I was just like, well, the message is being delivered into these microphones, I suppose. And the microphones are the thing that are really conveying the actual message of Martin Luther King. But
yeah, taking sort of a step back from the essay, I'm curious to know about your general interest in writing and sort of how you came about writing this sort of work on Dennis Hopper, and any other projects you might be taking on now.
Well, sort of, I started out writing in my sort of late teens and early 20s, and I was just a reader from quite a young age. I grew up in England. I grew up in a small village. It had a very small little library that I would just frequent every week and take a stack of books out with me and return them the next week, having pretty much read them all. It was mostly like nonfiction, like local history and things like that. And yeah, so I was just really sort of interested in writing. So from like, I don't know, the age of 17, 18, I was taking a stab at short stories, basically just at that point very much imitating the people that I was reading at the time. So I was a big reader of Hunter S. Thompson and Charles Bukowski. So a lot of my writing from that period is thankfully lost now, because it's pretty embarrassing to go back and take a look at some of that stuff. But yeah, like, and then I worked in a bookstore, so I was always surrounded by books, and I work in a library now, so I'm still surrounded by books. I just continuously wrote, and then for years just writing with no real goal other than just doing it. And then really I didn't hit my stride until I was into my 30s, really. So yeah, it's been about 10 years of publishing and writing for publication.
And what would you say are some of the ideas that you keep coming back to? I know Dennis Hopper is one of them.
Dennis Hopper is continuously one I come back to. Yeah. I write a lot about film. I've had a few books published on film, and I write for a few film publications and politics and culture publications, and I predominantly look at the lens of film. So, but the continuous theme that I kind of always return to is this idea, I suppose, that kind of film is just really important. It's a window into another world, or a portal into another reality.
Yeah.
And it can sort of change our perspectives or reaffirm our perspectives. But I think it's just a really important art form. So that's kind of where I'm always pointing to. And if I watch a film and it inspires me to write something, then I will. And usually the end comment is that the film is worthy of some sort of analysis, simply because it can kind of potentially change our perspective, and also kind of using film to reflect, our sort of current circumstances within politics and within culture, predominantly from a left perspective as well. So yeah, that's kind of where I sit.
I always tell people, my friends and whoever else, that when I'm watching movies, I tend to, I'll watch anything and I'll read anything and interact with any type of art, because I'm always looking for that moment, or those moments where I feel like something's been said that I can really appreciate, or that adds to my idea of the world, or my perspective on things.
Absolutely.
Or it's just a very beautiful shot or a beautiful scene. So yeah, I like that.
I agree. It can be a little like naive, but I still really think that there is a opportunity there for art to maybe not change the world, but change a person.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And what's currently inspiring you to write?
I think the mess that the world is in right now is sometimes worthy of some analysis. Again, mostly through the lens of film. It's interesting, I suppose, in the last couple of years, the way that I write has changed a little bit. I used to be one of these people that would, create a good space of time to sort of sit and think and write, and I don't know, like try and draw in inspiration or something. And now, really, I don't know, maybe it's just with technology, it's so much easier just to write anywhere, and on the go. So, I've been using my phone to write. I've got like a transcription app and things like that. So if anything just kind of comes to me, I'm like, I just throw it in there, and then one day I'll go and take another look at it, and then I'll think, oh yeah, okay, I want to follow through on this. So, I mean, however messy the world gets, I still want to write it, just to sort of what you maybe just said there, just try and grab that moment, and try and hold on to something that potentially is hopeful.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think when you write for a long time, you sort of have that drive to keep writing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't feel like I ever want to like give up, because even when I've had a lull in my writing, something always just pops up and it's like I'm back into it again. It's like I've just got to do it, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And is anything
Even if it's just for myself, it doesn't have to be for everybody, you know.
yeah, absolutely. Is anything piquing your interest now? Are you working on anything currently?
Well, so at the moment, actually, I mean, this is kind of why Dennis Hopper was back in my mind recently, because I'm working on another book about him, but it deals with his directorial films and the soundtracks that were sort of put on those films. So it's for a series called Filmmakers and Their Soundtracks, published by Routledge. So it's another academic text on Dennis Hopper. But, you know, like what really is interesting about him is that, you know, he only directed 7 movies, and really only 5 of them are kind of like worth some analysis. Whatever these films do, the soundtrack really does a lot of like the cultural and political kind of work that a lot of his films are kind of remembered for. So when you go to like Easy Rider, you haven't seen it yet, but when you do watch it, you'll notice that, you know, it's popular music from that time. It's Bob Dylan, it's Jimi Hendrix, the Byrds, Steppenwolf, you know, these bands that were kind of on the airwaves at that time, and they kind of do that, you know, political kind of work, right? And then he made a film in the mid-80s called Colors, which is a kind of police procedural film. But it has this incredible soundtrack of like rap and hip hop that was just unheard of in the mid-80s, really. And that was kind of one of the first films to include rap and hip hop, and also a soundtrack record that also sold like an incredible amount of units. So that kind of was really interesting that he had an involvement in that. And one of his other films before that was called Out of the Blue, which kind of had this kind of punk rock soundtrack to it. A later film that he made had Miles Davis and John Lee Hooker on it, creating a whole new piece of work. So I'm really just like fascinated by this idea that he just, like, the soundtrack was just so important to his films. So I kind of, for at the moment, that's kind of what I'm working on, and I'm just kind of in the editing process of that right now. And again, the great thing is about writing a book like this is you're working with a different editor, and the editor that I'm working with right now is just brutal. Like, just wants me like cut, no emphasis here. And that's kind of the writing that I do. I like to overemphasize, and it's really interesting to work with someone different and they're telling you that everything that you've been doing is like, no, just cut. Let's get to the point. It's like really interesting. So yeah.
Are you giving any pushback? I know Dennis Hopper would probably push back on
right. I totally. No, I'm kind of going with it. I think the guy who's editing, he's got his, you know, he's the head of the series, and it's his series, and I'll do what he says. But I've been finding it quite a revelation. So
awesome.
Quite interested in that. So yeah, that'll hopefully see the light of day sometime in the next year or so. But it's academic presses, and it can take a lot of time. So, but it's an interesting re-engagement with Dennis Hopper's work, which kind of led me back into this you know, article that I wrote for you guys.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm hoping that I can ask a big question, which I've been asking everyone I've been chatting with, because I'm curious. But in your opinion, what do you think is the purpose of art?
It's a tough one to answer, and I can really only give you like a personal point of view, I suppose. It's kind of like, for me, like and this goes back to my engagement with Dennis Hopper and the way that he thought about art. It's escapism, and it's also kind of like nourishment as well. Nourishment for the soul was kind of the way that he saw his own art, but also the art that he purchased and engaged with. You know, all of this just like feeds into my creative life. So I think art is really important. It's also very broad as well, because, you know, I really do sort of regard film as an art form, and music as art, and dance, and everything that really falls into the creative kind of pattern. And so, yeah, like there's no real definitive answer, but I just think that we need it really badly. I think it's a necessity that we just can't let go of. And, you know, it's really difficult to create art and engage with art when you kind of live in this, you know, neoliberalist world, because art really can't be commodified in a sort of sense. I mean, obviously, you know, a film is a mainstream film, but it's still artistic. Music is obviously something that is commodified, but when you think of like a visual art, like a painting or you know, something like that, it can't be commodified, it can't be sold, and therefore it's no good to people, or it's good for people but no good to the people who rule us.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, you know, yeah, so I see it around, especially in the UK, you know, where I'm from, that they really are like cutting art programs and art funding as much as they possibly can, and it's such a massive shame. So, you know, it's very, very important that we hold on to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone has their own opinion about it, which is the best part. But one of my favorite things about the Dennis Hopper documentary that I watched was when he was describing how he created the last movie. I think that's what it's called. And he was saying how everyone hated that movie. The people working on it hated it. The people who watched it hated it. But he loved it. And he was like, I felt like that was enough, but it wasn't enough to anyone else.
That is a film which, you know, probably should have been made under the independent film system, but instead it was kind of given the green light by like Universal Studios, right? And it's like, it's an incredibly artistic film. It is available in Canada. I know that it's streaming on Canopy, and it streams on another channel as well, probably Criterion or something like that. And it takes some time to really appreciate that film, because you are thrown into something which you just don't even, I mean, maybe today, because we've had more artistic films in the last, you know, 40 odd years, 50 years, our brains probably are a bit more wired for it. But the last movie, when it was released in 71, must have just been so bizarre for people, because it was an art film. Like, it is a film that really shouldn't have been playing in a cinema, but more in like an art gallery or something like that. It's an object. Yeah. It's not really a narrative film that we're kind of used to, but it's so worth engaging. Again, it's one of those films, it's like nourishment for the soul. It's so good for you to watch.
Yeah.
Yeah, even though at the end of it, you kind of don't know what is happening. You're overwhelmed. I think it's a great film. Sometimes
we need those types of movies, types of art.
Yeah, absolutely we do. Yeah.
And maybe it's just for the creator to enjoy, and that's okay.
It is okay. Yeah. It probably shouldn't have taken $1 million from Universal Studios, though, if that was just the plan for him to enjoy it. But, you know, of course. Yeah.
And on that note, those were all the questions I had for you. Is there anything you wanted to add before we wrap it up?
Oh, I don't think so. No, I think that's been really great. Yeah, okay. Really enjoyable little chat.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.